The tattoo snaked down her neck like a brand of rebellion, dark ink against pale skin that made every officer in the briefing room uncomfortable. They whispered when she passed, assumed things about her judgment, her discipline, her worth as a soldier. But what they didn't know was that beneath the sniper's mask, behind the scope of a rifle at 1,200 yards, Irene Hill had already saved more lives than most of them would in their entire careers. And when she finally removed that mask in front of the SEAL commander, his frozen expression would reveal a truth that would shatter every assumption they'd made about the young European woman they'd so easily dismissed. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The North African sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating base Scorpion, turning the sand into a shimmering ocean of heat that made everything waver like a mirage. Irene Hill stood at the edge of the compound, her eyes scanning the distant ridgeline through polarized sunglasses, a bottle of water hanging forgotten in her left hand. The tattoo that curved from behind her right ear down the side of her neck was fully visible in the morning light, an intricate pattern of Celtic knots interwoven with what looked like raven feathers, dark against her fair skin. She'd arrived at the base 3 weeks ago, transferred from a special operations unit in Eastern Europe, and the reaction had been immediate. The stares, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the barely concealed skepticism from officers who couldn't reconcile her appearance with the impressive service record that had preceded her arrival. At 26, Irene stood 5'7", with the lean, controlled build of someone who'd spent years perfecting physical efficiency over raw strength. Her auburn hair was typically pulled back in a regulation bun, but it did nothing to hide the tattoo that had become her defining feature in the eyes of her new unit. What they saw was ink and assumed rebellion. What they didn't see were the 3 confirmed saves during classified operations, the advanced marksmanship certifications, or the psychological profile that rated her as one of the most stable operators in high-stress situations. The base hummed with its mid-morning rhythm, vehicles moving between buildings, personnel shifting between duties, and somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic crack of rifle fire from the training range. Irene had requested range time every day since arriving, but her requests kept getting bumped for priority personnel. The message was clear, even if unspoken. Snipers with neck tattoos weren't priority personnel. She'd learned to read the subtle language of dismissal over the past 3 weeks. Lieutenant Pierce avoided direct eye contact during briefings. Sergeant Davies assigned her to equipment maintenance rather than operational planning. Even the other snipers in the unit, men she should have been working alongside, kept a professional distance that felt more like quarantine than caution. The breaking point had come yesterday during a tactical briefing. Commander Hayes, the SEAL team leader who ran joint operations from the base, had been outlining a reconnaissance mission when Irene raised her hand to suggest an alternative overwatch position. The room had gone quiet in that particular way that meant people were embarrassed on her behalf. Hill, Hayes had said, not bothering to hide his irritation, when we need input on equipment requisitions, we'll let you know. Tactical planning is for operators with field experience in this theater. The fact that she had more field experience than half the people in that room didn't matter. The tattoo had already told them everything they thought they needed to know about her judgment and professionalism. Now, standing in the morning sun, Irene replayed that moment and felt the familiar burn of frustration mixed with determination. She'd faced skepticism before, had dealt with assumptions and prejudice in various forms throughout her military career, but this felt different. This felt like being invisible while simultaneously being the most visible person on the base. Hill, the sharp voice cut through her thoughts. Sergeant Davies approached across the compound, his expression set in its usual lines of mild disapproval. Commander Hayes wants to see you in the operations center. Now, Irene nodded, draining the last of her water and crushing the bottle. As she walked toward the operations center, she was aware of the eyes that followed her, the conversations that paused. The tattoo felt like it was burning on her neck, though she knew that was just her imagination. She'd gotten it 6 years ago, after her first deployment, during a period when she needed something permanent to anchor herself to who she'd become. The Celtic knots represented her Irish grandmother's heritage. The raven feathers symbolized the watchers and protectors from old stories her grandmother had told her as a child. But nobody here knew that story. They just saw ink and made their assumptions. The operations center was blessedly cool, the air conditioning working overtime against the desert heat. Commander Hayes stood at the central table, surrounded by satellite imagery and tactical maps. He was a man in his early 40s, with the weathered competence of someone who'd spent 20 years earning his position. When Irene entered, he glanced up briefly, his eyes catching on her neck tattoo before flicking away. "Hill, we have a situation," he said without preamble. "Intel suggests a high-value target is meeting with local insurgent leaders in a compound approximately 40 clicks north of here. We need overwatch for the surveillance team." Irene's pulse quickened. This was operational work, real work, not equipment maintenance or perimeter security. "Yes, sir. When do we deploy?" Hayes exchanged glances with Lieutenant Pierce, who stood nearby reviewing documents. The hesitation was brief but unmistakable. "The thing is, Hill, this is a sensitive operation. The Overwatch position requires someone who can maintain discipline under extended observation conditions. Someone who understands the importance of following protocols exactly. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Someone without visible tattoos that suggested poor judgment. "Sir," Irene said carefully, keeping her voice level despite the anger building in her chest, "my service record shows 72 hours of continuous overwatch during Operation Northern Light. With successful identification and tracking of 16 targets, I'm qualified for this assignment. Your service record also shows a tendency toward individualistic choices," Pierce interjected, his tone making it clear he was referring to her appearance. "In joint operations with our SEAL teams, we need people who demonstrate conventional military bearing." Irene felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't just about one mission. This was about every mission, every opportunity, every chance to prove herself being filtered through the lens of that tattoo. "With respect, sir," she said, meeting Hayes' eyes directly, "my appearance has nothing to do with my operational capabilities. I'm requesting the opportunity to prove that." Hayes studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed. "Hill, I'm not saying you're not capable. I'm saying that in this theater, with these partners, perception matters. The local forces we work with have certain expectations about Western military personnel. A female sniper with visible tattoos sends the wrong message. So assign me to night operations," Irene countered. "Full tactical gear, face covering, long sleeves. Nobody sees anything but my performance." Pierce started to object, but Hayes raised a hand. "Actually, that's not a bad point." He turned back to the maps, considering. "There's another situation developing. We've got reports of insurgent activity in the eastern sector, night movements that suggest they're planning something. Could use a dedicated overwatch on the likely routes." It wasn't the mission Irene had hoped for, but it was something. "I can do that, sir." "You'll be working independently," Hayes warned. "No direct support, communication only for emergency extraction or critical intel. You'd be out there for potentially 72 hours in observation mode. Think you can handle that without supervision?" The question carried an edge, another test disguised as concern. Irene met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. That's exactly the kind of assignment I'm trained for." Hayes nodded slowly. "All right, brief in my office at 1,400 hours. And Hill, this is your chance to show us what you can do. Don't waste it." As Irene left the operations center, she felt the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just an assignment, it was a test, a trial by fire meant to prove whether the woman with the tattoo could perform when nobody was watching. The irony wasn't lost on her. They didn't trust her judgment because of her appearance, so they were sending her out alone where judgment would be everything. She had 6 hours to prepare for a mission that would either validate her capabilities or confirm every skeptical assumption they'd made about her. Irene headed toward her quarters, already mentally running through her equipment checklist. The tattoo on her neck felt like both a burden and a badge of honor, a permanent reminder that she'd always have to work twice as hard to earn half the respect. But she'd been working twice as hard her entire career. This would be no different. The preparation consumed Irene's afternoon. In her quarters, a sparse room that held little more than a cot, a footlocker, and a small desk, she laid out her gear with methodical precision. The ghillie suit that would help her disappear into the rocky terrain, the suppressed rifle that had been her companion through 4 deployments, the observation equipment that would be her eyes on the insurgent routes, and the mask, the tactical face covering that would hide everything, including the tattoo that had defined her in the eyes of this unit. She held the black fabric in her hands, feeling its weight. Part of her resented needing it, resented that covering her appearance was necessary to be taken seriously. But another part, the practical operator who'd learned to work within systems even when those systems were flawed, understood that this was her opportunity. Once she was out in the field, stripped of everything but performance, she could finally show them what she was capable of. The briefing at 1,400 hours was attended by Commander Hayes, Lieutenant Pierce, and 2 intelligence analysts Irene hadn't met before. They laid out the situation with clinical efficiency. Intelligence suggested that insurgent forces were using the eastern routes to move weapons and personnel under cover of darkness. The Overwatch position would give them eyes on 3 major pathways, allowing them to track movements and identify key players. Your job is observation and intelligence gathering, Hayes emphasized, pointing to the topographical maps spread across his desk. You see something, you report it. You do not engage unless absolutely necessary for self-defense. Understood? Understood, sir, Irene replied. Pierce handed her a satellite phone and encryption key. Communication protocols are standard. Check in every 8 hours unless you have actionable intelligence. If you need extraction, use the emergency beacon, but understand that getting to your position will take time. The position itself is here. Hayes indicated a ridge that overlooked a natural funnel point in the terrain. It's approximately 1,200 yards from the primary route, which should give you adequate standoff distance while maintaining observation capability. Intel suggests increased activity starting tomorrow night, so you'll insert tonight and be in position before dawn. One of the analysts, a thin man with nervous hands, spoke up. We should note that there have been reports of counter-sniper activity in the region. These aren't unsophisticated fighters. If they detect your position, they will attempt to neutralize you. Understood? Irene said calmly. The warning didn't faze her. Risk was part of the job, and she'd faced sophisticated opponents before. Hayes studied her carefully. Hill, I want to be clear about something. This assignment is important, but it's also a test. I need to know that the person in that hide site is making sound tactical decisions, following protocols, and maintaining the discipline necessary for extended solo operations. Your performance here will determine your role in this unit going forward. The subtext was obvious. Prove yourself or remain sidelined. I understand, sir. I won't let you down. After the briefing, Irene had 4 hours before insertion. She spent it in her quarters, running through mental preparation techniques she'd developed over years of high-stress operations. The key to successful Overwatch wasn't just physical endurance or marksmanship. It was mental discipline, the ability to maintain focus and clarity over extended periods while managing the psychological strain of isolation. She thought about her grandmother, who'd passed away 2 years ago, the woman who'd told her stories of warriors and watchers, who'd encouraged her to be strong in her own way rather than trying to fit others' expectations. The tattoo on her neck was a tribute to those stories, a reminder of the strength that came from knowing who you were regardless of others' opinions. At 1,800 hours, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Irene gathered her gear and headed to the transport vehicle. The driver, a young corporal who couldn't have been more than 20, kept glancing at her neck tattoo in the rearview mirror but said nothing. They drove in silence through the desert, the landscape painted in oranges and purples by the setting sun. The insertion point was a rocky outcropping 15 clicks from the base. Irene would hike the remaining distance to her observation position under cover of darkness, arriving well before dawn. As she shouldered her pack and checked her rifle one final time, the corporal finally spoke. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, that tattoo, does it mean something? Irene looked at him, surprised by the genuine curiosity in his voice rather than judgment. It's about being a watcher, she said simply. Someone who sees what others miss and protects what matters. The corporal nodded slowly. That's actually pretty cool. Good luck out there, ma'am. It was a small moment, but it reminded Irene that not everyone saw the tattoo as a mark against her. Some people were capable of looking deeper. The hike to the observation position took 3 hours. Irene moved through the darkness with practiced efficiency, using night vision equipment to navigate the terrain while maintaining awareness of her surroundings. The desert at night was alive with sounds that city dwellers would never recognize. The skitter of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind across sand, the distant howl of wild dogs. She reached the ridge position at 2,300 hours and immediately began constructing her hide site. The location was ideal, offering clear sight lines to the 3 routes while providing natural concealment among the rocks. She arranged the ghillie suit to blend with the surrounding terrain, set up her observation equipment, and established her shooting position with careful attention to comfort and stability. By 0200 hours, everything was in place. Irene settled into the rhythm of observation, scanning the routes with thermal and optical equipment, noting the natural patterns of the landscape so she could identify anything unusual. The mask covered her face completely, leaving only her eyes visible. The tattoo, source of so much judgment and skepticism, was hidden beneath tactical clothing. Out here, she was just an operator. No assumptions, no prejudice, just skill and determination. The first night passed without incident. Irene maintained her observation protocols, checking in with base at the scheduled times, reporting no activity. The second day brought intense heat that tested her hydration planning and mental endurance. She remained motionless for hours at a time, becoming part of the landscape, a watcher invisible to any eyes that might sweep the ridgeline. It was on the second night, at approximately 2,130 hours, that everything changed. Irene detected movement on the central route, a group of figures moving with tactical discipline rather than the casual pace of local travelers. She brought her optics to bear and began counting. 12 individuals, armed, moving in a formation that suggested military training. She activated her communication equipment and began transmitting intel back to base. Overwatch to base, I have 12 military-age males moving north on Route Charlie, armed with what appears to be AK pattern rifles and RPGs. Marking their position now. Hayes' voice came back through her earpiece. Copy that, Overwatch. Continue observation and report any changes. But Irene had already noticed something else. A second group, smaller and moving more carefully, approaching from the east on a route that intel hadn't considered significant. And they were moving directly toward a position that, according to her briefing maps, was supposed to contain a friendly reconnaissance team. Her mind raced through the tactical situation. The recon team had no idea they were about to be flanked. If she broke radio silence to warn them, she might compromise her position. But if she didn't, those soldiers could walk into an ambush. It was exactly the kind of judgment call that her commanders had doubted she could make. Irene made her decision in less than 3 seconds. She switched to the emergency frequency and transmitted a warning to the recon team, providing exact coordinates and enemy strength. Then she shifted her position, bringing her rifle to bear on the approaching insurgent group. The response was immediate. The recon team acknowledged her warning and began adjusting their position. But the insurgents had detected something, their formation shifting from approach to assault. Irene watched through her scope as the situation deteriorated from potential ambush to active engagement. The first shot came from the insurgent position, a crack that echoed across the valley. Irene didn't hesitate. Her first round took out the insurgent who appeared to be directing the assault. Her second dropped the fighter manning what looked like a radio. Precision shots at 800 yards, in darkness, with lives hanging in the balance. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. Irene's intervention had given the recon team time to establish a defensive position and call for support. By the time quick reaction forces arrived, the insurgent group had scattered, leaving behind 3 casualties from Irene's rifle and a wealth of intelligence materials they'd abandoned in their retreat. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The extraction helicopter arrived at dawn, its rotors cutting through the pink-streaked sky like thunder. Irene remained in position until the recon team was safely aboard, then broke down her hide sight with practiced efficiency. She moved down the ridge with her gear, the mask still covering her face, the tactical clothing concealing every inch of skin, including the tattoo that had defined her back at base. Commander Hayes himself was waiting at the landing zone, standing beside the helicopter with his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable as Irene approached, her rifle slung across her back, her movements showing the exhaustion of 72 hours in the field with minimal rest. "Hill," he said simply, his voice barely audible over the rotors. "Sir," she replied, her own voice muffled by the mask. The flight back to base was tense. Hayes sat across from her in the helicopter, studying her with an intensity that made the other soldiers uncomfortable. Irene kept her mask on, her eyes forward, letting her actions speak louder than any words could. She'd saved the recon team. She'd provided actionable intelligence. She'd made the right tactical decisions under pressure, everything her commanders had doubted she could do. When they landed at FOB Scorpion, a crowd had gathered. News of the successful intervention had spread through the base, and soldiers lined the tarmac to see the sniper who'd taken down 3 insurgents at 800 yards in darkness. But when Irene stepped off the helicopter, still masked and covered, there was a collective confusion. They'd been expecting someone else, someone who fit their mental image of an elite operator. Hayes led her directly to the operations center, bypassing the crowd. Inside, Lieutenant Pierce and several senior officers were waiting, along with the 4 members of the recon team she'd saved. One of them, a sergeant with a bandaged arm, stepped forward immediately. "That's her," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "That's the shooter who saved our lives. Ma'am, we owe you everything." Hayes held up a hand. "Everyone, let's debrief this properly. Hill, walk us through your decision-making process." For the next hour, Irene provided a detailed account of her observations, her tactical assessment, and her decision to break protocol to warn the recon team. She spoke clearly and professionally, her mask still in place, explaining each choice with the kind of clarity that came from absolute certainty in her actions. "You broke radio silence," Pierce pointed out, though his tone lacked its usual skepticism. "That could have compromised your position." "Yes, sir," Irene agreed. "I assessed that the immediate threat to friendly forces outweighed the risk to my position. The insurgents were already moving toward the recon team. Without warning, we would have lost 4 soldiers and valuable intelligence assets." Hayes leaned back in his chair. "And the decision to engage? You were under orders to observe only. Self-defense protocols extend to defense of friendly forces under imminent threat," Irene replied. "The insurgents were preparing to ambush our team. Engaging was the correct tactical decision, and it prevented casualties while securing the intelligence materials they abandoned." One of the senior officers, a colonel Irene hadn't met before, nodded approvingly. Sound judgment under pressure. Textbook crisis decision-making. He looked at Hayes. "Commander, I think we need to reevaluate how we're utilizing Specialist Hill's capabilities." Hayes' jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Agreed." He turned back to Irene. "Hill, you've proven yourself in the field. Your actions saved lives and provided valuable intelligence. Going forward, you'll be integrated into operational planning and assigned to active missions." It was the validation she'd been seeking, the recognition she'd earned through performance rather than appearance. But Irene felt a strange disconnect. They still didn't know who she really was. They were praising the masked sniper while still judging the woman with the tattoo. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "Permission to remove my mask and gear?" Hayes gestured his approval. "Of course. You've been out there for 3 days." Irene reached up and slowly pulled off the tactical mask, revealing her face and, inevitably, the Celtic tattoo that curved down her neck. The room went silent. The officers who'd been nodding approvingly suddenly looked uncomfortable. The recon team members showed confusion, trying to reconcile the elite operator who'd saved them with the woman they'd been taught to dismiss. Hayes' expression froze completely. The silence stretched until it became painful. Commander Hayes stared at Irene's neck, at the tattoo that was now fully visible in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the operations center. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The expression on his face cycled through disbelief, recognition, and something that looked uncomfortably like shame. "You're the sniper from the ridge?" he said slowly, as if saying the words aloud might make them untrue. "You're the one who made those shots." "Yes, sir," Irene replied, meeting his eyes steadily. "Same person you assigned to equipment maintenance 3 weeks ago because visible tattoos suggested poor judgment." Lieutenant Pierce had gone pale. "But we thought, your appearance." "My appearance has nothing to do with my capabilities, sir," Irene said, her voice calm but carrying an edge. "That's what I tried to tell you during the tactical briefing. That's what I've been trying to prove since I arrived at this base." The recon team sergeant stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Ma'am, when they told us a sniper saved our lives, we assumed. We expected." He trailed off, unable to articulate the assumptions that now seemed so foolish. "You expected someone who looked like your idea of an elite operator," Irene finished for him. "Someone without visible tattoos. Someone who fit the conventional image of military excellence." Hayes found his voice, though it sounded strained. "Hill, I owe you an apology. We all do. We let your appearance cloud our judgment about your capabilities. That was wrong, and it was unprofessional." "With respect, sir, it was more than unprofessional," Irene replied. "It was dangerous. For 3 weeks, you had an operator with advanced training and field experience sitting on the sidelines because of ink on her skin. How many missions could I have supported? How many situations could I have helped with?" The colonel who'd praised her performance earlier cleared his throat. "Specialist Hill raises a valid point. Commander Hayes, this represents a significant failure in personnel utilization. We need to address how we assess and assign personnel in this theater." Hayes nodded stiffly, but his eyes remained on Irene. "You're right. All of you are right. Hill, I let personal bias interfere with operational decisions. That's inexcusable for someone in my position." "It's not just you, sir," Irene said, her voice softening slightly. "This entire base made assumptions about me from the moment I arrived. The tattoo became a shorthand for everything you thought I was. Undisciplined, rebellious, poor judgment. Nobody asked what it meant or why I have it." "What does it mean?" one of the recon team members asked quietly. Irene touched the tattoo lightly. "It's about being a watcher and a protector. The Celtic knots represent my grandmother's heritage, her stories about warriors who protected their people. The raven feathers symbolize those who see what others miss, who stand guard while others sleep. My grandmother told me that true strength isn't about fitting in. It's about knowing who you are and serving that purpose, regardless of others' expectations." The room had gone quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Contemplative rather than uncomfortable. Hayes ran a hand over his face. "I served with your previous unit commander, Davidson, about 5 years ago. When your transfer papers came through, I called him for a reference. Do you know what he told me?" Irene shook her head. "He said you were the most dedicated operator he'd ever worked with. He said you had an instinct for tactical situations that couldn't be taught. And he said that people who judged you on appearance were making a mistake they'd eventually regret." Hayes smiled ruefully. "I thought I was smarter than that. Turns out I wasn't." "Most people aren't, sir," Irene replied. "That's why I've learned to prove myself through actions rather than arguments." Pierce spoke up, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "Hill, about the tactical briefing last week when you suggested that alternative Overwatch position, it would have worked," Irene interrupted gently. "The position I suggested had better sight lines and cover than the one you used. Your team spent an extra 3 hours exposed because you dismissed my input." Pierce winced. "I know. I reviewed the mission footage afterward. You were right." The colonel stood up. "Commander Hayes, I'm recommending that Specialist Hill be assigned to your SEAL liaison team immediately. Her skills are being wasted in support roles, and clearly her tactical insight is valuable. Additionally, I'm ordering a review of our personnel assessment protocols across this theater. If we're making these kinds of mistakes with Hill, we're probably making them with others." Hayes nodded. "Agreed. Hill, effective immediately. You're assigned to direct operational support. You'll attend all tactical briefings, provide overwatch for SEAL operations, and contribute to mission planning. No more equipment maintenance unless it's your own gear." It was everything Irene had wanted. the recognition and opportunities she'd been denied. But standing in that room, watching officers who dismissed her scramble to make amends, she felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She'd proven herself, yes, but only after being forced to hide the very thing they judged her for. "Thank you, sir," she said. "I won't let you down." "You already haven't," Hayes replied. Word spread through FOB Scorpion faster than the desert wind. By evening, everyone knew the story. The sniper who'd said, "Save the recon team," the one they'd all been talking about with respect and admiration, was the same woman with the neck tattoo they'd been dismissing for weeks. The revelation created ripples of uncomfortable self-reflection throughout the base. Irene spent the afternoon in her quarters, finally getting the rest she'd been denied during the 3-day observation mission. When she emerged for dinner, the mess hall went quiet as she entered. But this time, the silence wasn't judgment. It was something closer to awe, mixed with embarrassment. She filled her tray and sat at an empty table, expecting to eat alone as she had for the past 3 weeks. Instead, the recon team sergeant approached, his bandaged arm in a sling. "Ma'am, would you mind if we joined you?" he asked, gesturing to his 3 teammates. Irene looked up, surprised. "Of course, please." The 4 men sat down, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Finally, the sergeant extended his good hand. "I'm Sergeant Alex Brennan. I don't think we properly introduced ourselves earlier. These are my team: Corporal James Rivera, Private First Class David O'Connor, and Specialist Kumar Patel." Irene shook hands with each of them. "Irene Hill, though I guess you already know that." "Ma'am, I need to say something," Brennan began, his voice earnest. "When we got back and heard about the sniper on the ridge, we built up this image in our heads. Some grizzled veteran, probably male, probably covered in conventional military bearing. When you took off that mask," he paused, struggling with the words, "I realized how wrong we'd been, how wrong I'd been." "You weren't alone in that," Irene replied quietly. "This whole base made the same assumptions." Rivera leaned forward. "But that's the thing, ma'am, we shouldn't have. Your service record was available. Your qualifications were documented. We chose to ignore all of that because of how you look." "People judge what they can see," Irene said. "It's human nature. The tattoo is visible, so it becomes the defining characteristic. Everything else becomes secondary." "That's not an excuse," Patel interjected. "In our line of work, making assumptions can get people killed. We should know better." O'Connor, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? Why did you warn us? You could have maintained your position, stayed safe, and just observed. Instead, you risked everything to save people who'd been judging you since you arrived." Irene considered the question carefully. "Because that's the job. Personal feelings don't matter when lives are at stake. You were my fellow soldiers in danger. Everything else is secondary to that." "Even though we didn't treat you like a fellow soldier?" Brennan asked. "Especially because of that," Irene replied. "The military taught me that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. If I'd let personal resentment interfere with my duty, I'd be no better than the people who judged me for my back. Appearance." The 4 men exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Brennan spoke again. "Ma'am, we'd like to buy you a drink. Well, a coffee, since that's all we have here. And we'd like to hear the real story behind that tattoo, if you're willing to share it." For the first time since arriving at FOB Scorpion, Irene felt something warm in her chest. Not validation through performance, but genuine human connection. "I'd like that," she said. They moved to a quieter corner of the mess hall, and Irene told them about her grandmother, about growing up hearing stories of Celtic warriors and protectors, about getting the tattoo after her first deployment as a reminder of who she was and what she fought for. "The raven feathers represent the watchers," she explained. "In my grandmother's stories, ravens were the eyes of the gods, seeing what mortals couldn't. They warned of danger and protected the innocent. When I became a sniper, it felt like I'd found my purpose, being the watcher, the one who sees threats before they materialize." "That's actually profound," Rivera said. And we all looked at it and just saw unprofessional tattoo. "Most people do," Irene agreed. "That's why I usually keep it covered during initial meetings." But I'd been at this base for 3 weeks. I figured if people were going to judge me, I might as well give them something to judge. Except we didn't give you a chance to be anything else, Brennan said. We decided who you were based on ink and never looked deeper. Their conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Pierce approaching their table. He looked uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching humility. Hill, could I speak with you for a moment? He asked. Irene nodded and followed him to a private corner. Pierce cleared his throat several times before speaking. I owe you an apology, he began. A real one, not just the words I said in the briefing. I treated you with disrespect from the moment you arrived. I questioned your dedication, your judgment, your professionalism, all because of how you look. Yes, sir, Irene said simply. The thing is, Pierce continued, I pride myself on being a professional officer, someone who judges people on merit and capability. But with you, I failed completely. I let superficial prejudice override everything I claim to believe about military excellence. Sir, you're not the first person to make that mistake with me, Irene replied, and you won't be the last. That doesn't make it acceptable, Pierce insisted. The following morning brought a shift in the base's atmosphere that was almost tangible. When Irene entered the briefing room for the daily intelligence update, chairs scraped as several soldiers stood up to offer her a seat near the front. Commander Hayes nodded to her with genuine respect as she entered, and even the intelligence analysts who'd previously ignored her now made eye contact. Specialist Hill, Hayes began as the briefing started. I'd like you to provide your assessment of the terrain in the eastern sector. Your observations during the Overwatch mission gave us valuable intelligence about insurgent movement patterns. Irene stood and approached the map display, aware that every eye in the room was focused on her. The tattoo on her neck was fully visible, but for the first time since arriving at FOB Scorpion, it didn't feel like a liability. The insurgents are using a network of wadis and ridgelines that provide natural concealment, she explained, tracing routes on the digital map. They're avoiding the obvious pathways we've been monitoring and instead moving through terrain we've classified as too difficult for regular transit. But these aren't regular insurgents. They're trained, disciplined, and they understand how to use topography to their advantage. Recommendations? Hayes asked. We need Overwatch positions here, here, and here, Irene indicated 3 locations. These positions overlook the concealed routes and provide early warning of movement. Additionally, we should consider that if they're using these routes for movement, they're probably using them for logistics too. Weapons, caches, supply depots, potentially even training facilities. A senior SEAL operator named Lieutenant Commander Thompson, who'd arrived at the base overnight, studied the map thoughtfully. You're suggesting a comprehensive surveillance operation rather than reactive patrols. Yes, sir, Irene confirmed. Reactive operations in this terrain favor the insurgents. They know the ground better than we do, and they can choose when and where to engage. But if we establish persistent overwatch on their concealed routes, we shift the advantage to our side. Thompson nodded slowly. Commander Hayes, I'd like Specialist Hill assigned to my team for the next operation. We're planning a reconnaissance push into the northern sector, and her terrain analysis would be invaluable. It was a significant endorsement. Thompson was known throughout the special operations community as someone who only worked with the best. Hayes glanced at Irene, a question in his eyes. I'm available, sir, she said simply. Then it settled. Hayes replied. Hill, you'll brief Thompson's team this afternoon on terrain considerations and establish Overwatch protocols. As the briefing continued, Irene felt the weight of the past 3 weeks beginning to lift. She was finally being utilized the way she trained for, the way her capabilities warranted. But more than that, she'd forced an entire base to confront their assumptions and prejudices. After the briefing, Thompson approached her with an extended hand. Specialist Hill, I've heard a lot about you in the past 24 hours. Your previous unit commander, Davidson, is a friend of mine. He told me you were one of the best operators he'd worked with, but he also warned me that you'd face skepticism because of your appearance. He wasn't wrong, Irene replied. No, he wasn't, Thompson agreed. But here's the thing. In my experience, the best operators are often the ones who don't fit the conventional mold. They bring perspectives and capabilities that the standard issue soldier doesn't have. Your tattoo tells me you're someone who knows who they are and isn't afraid to show it. That's exactly the kind of operator I want on my team. It was the first time someone had framed her tattoo as an asset rather than a liability. Irene felt something in her chest loosen, a tension she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that perspective." "Don't thank me yet," Thompson said with a slight smile. "The Northern Sector operation is going to be challenging. We'll be operating in hostile territory for up to 2 weeks, gathering intelligence on a suspected training facility. I need people who can maintain discipline and effectiveness under extended stress. Think you're up for that?" "Absolutely, sir." "Good. Brief my team at 1,500 hours. And Hill, bring that map you were working on during your off hours, the one you thought nobody knew about." Irene's eyes widened slightly. "How did you? Davidson told me you'd probably be preparing for opportunities even while being sidelined." He was right. Thompson's expression grew more serious. "The military needs more people like you, Hill. People who refuse to accept limitations, who prepare for the mission even when they're not officially part of it. Don't let this experience make you bitter. Let it make you better." As Thompson walked away, Irene stood in the briefing room feeling a profound sense of validation. Not just because her skills were being recognized, but because someone finally understood that her dedication hadn't wavered despite the dismissal she'd faced. The afternoon briefing with Thompson's SEAL team was everything Irene had hoped for. The operators listened intently as she outlined terrain considerations, potential threats, and overwatch strategies. They asked intelligent questions and treated her input with the respect it deserved. For the first time since arriving at FOB Scorpion, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. That evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of orange and purple, Irene stood at the same spot where she'd watched 3 weeks ago, feeling invisible and dismissed. Now, soldiers nodded respectfully as they passed. Her radio crackled with mission planning communications that included her call sign. The tattoo on her neck caught the fading light, no longer a mark of judgment, but simply a part of who she was. The Northern Sector operation launched at 0400 hours on a moonless night that turned the desert into an ocean of shadows. Irene moved with Thompson's 8-man SEAL team through terrain that would have been treacherous in daylight and was doubly dangerous in darkness. But she'd studied every ridge and valley on the route, had memorized elevation changes and potential hazards until the map lived in her mind as clearly as her own reflection. Thompson led from the front, setting a pace that tested even the fittest operators. Behind him, his team moved in tactical formation. 2-point men, the main element, and Irene positioned as rear security with her sniper rifle. It was a position of trust, responsible for protecting the team's most vulnerable angle. Overwatch. Status. Thompson's voice came through her earpiece, using her operational call sign. "Rear secure, no movement detected," Irene responded, her eyes constantly scanning their back trail through night vision equipment. They reached the primary observation position at 0730 hours, just as dawn began painting the eastern sky. The hide site overlooked a valley that intelligence suggested housed a training facility for insurgent fighters. Thompson's team would conduct surveillance for 2 weeks, documenting activity, patterns, and identifying key personnel. "Hill, establish your position on the northern ridge," Thompson ordered. "You'll provide overwatch and early warning if anyone approaches our location." Irene nodded and began the climb to her designated position, a rocky outcropping that offered clear sightlines across multiple approaches. The climb took 40 minutes, and by the time she reached the top, the sun had fully risen, bringing with it the desert's relentless heat. She constructed her hide site with meticulous care, using natural camouflage to blend into the rocks. Her position was 600 yards from the main team, close enough for rapid response but distant enough to provide independent observation. Once settled, she began the patient work of surveillance, watching, documenting, and waiting. The first 3 days established the rhythm of the operation. The valley below showed daily activity consistent with a training facility, groups of men conducting physical training, weapons drills, and tactical exercises. Irene documented everything, transmitting detailed reports to Thompson's position each evening after dark. On the 4th day, everything changed. Irene detected movement on the western approach at 1,430 hours. a single individual moving with the careful deliberation of someone conducting reconnaissance. She tracked him through her scope, noting the radio equipment and the way he systematically scanned the ridgelines. He was looking for observers, conducting counter-surveillance. Main element, this is Overwatch, she transmitted quietly. Single military-age male conducting counter-surveillance on western approach, 800 yards from your position. He's equipped with radio and optics. Assessment, he's hunting for observation posts. Thompson's response was immediate. Can you neutralize without compromising position? Irene calculated angles and wind, assessed the risk of the shot revealing her location. The insurgent was good, methodical in his search pattern. If he continued his current route, he'd eventually identify Thompson's hide site. Affirmative. Single shot, suppressed. Minimal signature. You're cleared to engage. Irene settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing, and waited for the perfect moment. The insurgent paused to scan the valley below, presenting a clear profile. She squeezed the trigger with practiced smoothness, and 800 yards away, the threat disappeared. Target neutralized, she reported calmly. Good shot, Overwatch. Maintain position and monitor for additional threats. But Irene had already noticed something concerning. The insurgent's radio was still transmitting its indicator light visible through her scope. He'd been in communication with someone when she'd taken the shot, which meant others knew he was conducting counter-surveillance in this area. Main element, be advised, target's radio was active during engagement. Recommend increased alert status. Thompson acknowledged and Irene watched. As the SEAL team shifted to higher defensive posture, her instinct proved correct when, 2 hours later, a 4-man team appeared on the same western approach, clearly searching for their missing comrade. This time, engagement wasn't an option. 4 targets meant multiple shots, which would definitely reveal her position and compromise the entire operation. Irene tracked them through her scope, documenting their search pattern and equipment while remaining absolutely still. The insurgents spent 30 minutes searching the area before recovering their fallen comrade's body. As they withdrew, Irene noted their discipline and training. These weren't simple fighters. They were professional soldiers conducting sophisticated operations. Main element, targets withdrawing, she reported. Assessment, we're dealing with highly trained opposition. They'll know someone took that shot, and they'll be looking for us. Thompson's voice carried a note of concern. Agreed. We may need to relocate. Our position ahead of schedule. Stand by for orders. Irene maintained her Overwatch position as darkness fell, her mind racing through tactical scenarios. The operation had just become significantly more dangerous, and the next 2 weeks would test every skill she developed over her career. The night brought unexpected visitors. At 0230 hours, Irene detected thermal signatures approaching from multiple directions, a coordinated search pattern that suggested the insurgents were determined to find whoever had killed their scout. She counted at least 20 individuals, far more than Thompson's team could engage without significant risk. Main element, this is Overwatch, she transmitted in barely a whisper. Multiple hostiles conducting area search, estimated 2 to 0 personnel, approaching from north, west, and south vectors. You're about to be surrounded. Thompson's response was clipped and professional. Can you provide harassment fire to open an eastern escape route? Irene assessed the tactical situation rapidly. Her position gave her clear shots on the northern and western approaches, but engaging would reveal her location and potentially draw fire onto Thompson's team. However, if she didn't act, the SEAL team would be trapped. Affirmative. Preparing to engage northern element. Recommend you move on my first shot. Standing by. Irene selected her targets carefully, identifying what appeared to be the leaders of the northern search group. Her first shot dropped the point man, creating immediate confusion. Her second and third shots targeted individuals with radio equipment, disrupting their communication. The suppressed rifle made minimal noise, but the insurgents knew they were under fire. The northern group immediately went defensive, taking cover and trying to locate the shooter. That moment of confusion was all Thompson needed. Irene watched through her scope as the SEAL team moved rapidly eastward, using the darkness and terrain to break contact with the encircling forces. But now she had a new problem. The insurgents had triangulated her general position from her shots, and armed men were beginning to climb toward her ridge. She had perhaps 10 minutes before they reached her location. Irene broke down her hide site with practiced speed, gathering essential equipment and abandoning anything that would slow her movement. She'd planned multiple escape routes during her initial setup, and now she activated the one that led northeast, away from both the insurgents and Thompson's team. The next 6 hours tested every survival skill Irene had developed. She moved through the darkness, using terrain features to mask her movement, while insurgent search teams combed the ridgelines. Twice she had to remain motionless while armed men passed within 50 feet of her position. Her heart hammered, but her breathing remained controlled and silent. At dawn, she found a secure position in a deep wadi and transmitted a status update. Main element, this is Overwatch. I've broken contact and am proceeding to alternate rally point Bravo. Status: operational, uninjured, low on water. Thompson's response took several minutes, during which Irene imagined various worst-case scenarios. Finally, copy, Overwatch. Excellent work last night. We're secure at fallback position, Charlie. Can you reach Rally Point Bravo by nightfall? Irene calculated the distance and terrain. Rally Point Bravo was 15 kilometers northeast, through hostile territory now actively searching for American forces. Affirmative, but I'll need to move during daylight hours to make the timeline. Understood. We'll have eyes on the rally point from 1,800 hours onward. Be careful, Hill. The use of her actual name rather than her call sign told Irene that Thompson was genuinely concerned. She secured her position as best she could and tried to rest during the hottest part of the day, knowing she'd need her strength for the movement ahead. At 1,400 hours, she began her approach to Rally Point Bravo. Moving during daylight was exponentially more dangerous, but the open terrain offered some advantages. She could see potential threats from greater distances and plan her route to maximize concealment. She was 3 kilometers from the rally point when she detected the ambush. A group of insurgents had established a position overlooking the most direct approach route, clearly anticipating that any American forces in the area would try to reach that location. They'd set up expertly, with interlocking fields of fire and good concealment. Irene observed them for 20 minutes, noting their positions and equipment. There were 8 fighters, well armed and disciplined. She could try to bypass them, but that would add hours to her journey and increase the risk of encountering other search teams. Alternatively, she could eliminate the threat, but 8 targets would require perfect execution. She keyed her radio. Main element, rally, point Bravo is compromised. 8 hostiles in ambush position overlooking primary approach. Request guidance. Thompson's response was immediate. Can you bypass? Negative. Any bypass route adds 3 to 4 hours and crosses open terrain under observation from the training facility. There was a pause as Thompson consulted with his team. Overwatch, we can provide fire support if you can designate targets. We have angle on the rally point from our position. Irene felt a surge of relief. She wasn't alone in this. Copy. Stand by for target designation. For the next 30 minutes, Irene worked with Thompson's team to coordinate a synchronized engagement. She would take the northern targets, Thompson's designated marksman would engage the southern positions, and the timing would be crucial to prevent any insurgents from escaping or calling for reinforcements. All elements, stand by. Thompson transmitted. Execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. Irene's rifle spoke 3 times in rapid succession, dropping her designated targets with precision. Simultaneously, she heard the crack of other rifles as Thompson's team engaged their targets. The ambush position erupted in controlled chaos, and within 15 seconds, all 8 insurgents were neutralized. Rally point secure. Thompson confirmed. Overwatch, you're clear to approach. Irene moved rapidly toward the rally point, where Thompson's team emerged from concealment to provide security. As she reached the position, Thompson extended his hand with a grin. Outstanding work, Hill. That counter-ambush was textbook perfect. The team consolidated at Rally Point Bravo, a cluster of rocks that provided decent cover and good observation of the surrounding terrain. Thompson's medic checked Irene for injuries while she reported on her observations from the past 24 hours. The intelligence she'd gathered during her solo movement would be valuable for understanding insurgent search patterns and capabilities. They're more organized than our initial assessment suggested, Irene explained, pointing to marks she'd made on her map. Disciplined search grids, professional communication protocols, and good tactical awareness. These aren't farmers with rifles. They're trained soldiers. Thompson studied her notations carefully, which means the training facility below is more significant than intelligence believed. We need to gather more information before we can call for an interdiction strike. One of Thompson's team members, a senior chief named Patterson, spoke up. Sir, with respect, we're compromised. They know we're in the area. Continuing the surveillance operation puts us at significant risk. Agreed, Thompson replied. But we also can't leave without actionable intelligence. That facility is training fighters who are killing American and Allied forces throughout the region. We need to document leadership, infrastructure, and capabilities. He turned to Irene. Hill, you've proven you can operate independently in this environment. How would you approach gathering the remaining intelligence we need? Irene considered the question carefully. Sir, they're expecting us to either extract or establish a new observation post at a safe distance. What they're not expecting is someone moving closer, using their own heightened security as cover. Explain, Thompson said. His interest clearly piqued. They've pushed their security perimeter outward, focusing on the ridgelines and approaches. That means the areas immediately adjacent to the facility are probably less heavily guarded than usual. If I can infiltrate close to the perimeter, I can gather detailed intelligence on leadership, training activities, and infrastructure. Patterson shook his head. That's a suicide mission. If you're detected at close range, there's no backup, no fire support, no extraction. Which is why they won't expect it, Irene countered. Every tactical principle says we should withdraw or maintain distance. Moving closer violates conventional wisdom, which makes it the last thing they'll anticipate. Thompson studied her intently. You're volunteering for this? Yes, sir. I can move tonight, gather intelligence tomorrow during their peak activity periods, and extract tomorrow night. 48 hours, and we'll have everything command needs to authorize a strike. The SEAL team leader was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential intelligence gain. Finally, he nodded. All right, Hill, but with modifications. You'll carry a laser designator in case we need to call in emergency fire support. And you'll maintain comm checks every 6 hours. Miss a check, and we come looking for you. Understood, sir. They spent the next 4 hours planning the infiltration in meticulous detail. Irene would approach from the east, using a wadi system that ran close to the facility's perimeter. She'd establish a hide site within 200 yards of the main compound, close enough to document activities with her optics and audio equipment. As darkness fell, Irene prepared her equipment. She traveled light, rifle, optics, recording equipment, emergency beacon, and minimal supplies. Every ounce mattered when moving through hostile territory. Thompson approached as she was making final adjustments to her gear. Hill, I want you to know something. What you're volunteering for goes beyond the call of duty. Nobody would fault you for taking the safer option. With respect, sir, the safer option isn't always the right option, Irene replied. Those insurgents are training fighters who will go on to kill American soldiers. If I can gather the intelligence needed to shut down that facility, it's worth the risk. Your previous commander was right about you, Thompson said. You're one of the best operators I've worked with. Just make sure you come back so I can put that in my official report. Irene smiled. I intend to, sir. The infiltration movement took 6 hours of careful navigation through darkness. Irene moved slowly, taking time to avoid potential observation points and security patrols. The insurgents were conducting regular sweeps of the outer perimeter, but their focus was on the ridge lines where they expected American observation posts to be located. She reached her target position at 0300 hours, a small depression in the terrain that offered concealment while providing a clear view of the facility's main entrance and training areas. She established her hide site with extreme care, using minimal materials and natural camouflage to blend into the surrounding terrain. As dawn broke, the facility came to life. Irene began documenting everything through her camera and optics. Training rotations, leadership figures, weapon storage locations, communication infrastructure. The intelligence was even better than she'd hoped. The facility wasn't just training basic fighters. It was conducting advanced tactical instruction including communications, explosives, and counter-surveillance techniques. At 0900 hours, she transmitted her first comm check. Main element, this is Overwatch. Position secure, gathering excellent intelligence, no compromise. Copy, Overwatch. Thompson responded. Continue mission. Next check at 1,500 hours. Irene settled in for the long observation period, her mind focused and her body motionless. This was what she trained for, what she excelled at. Being the watcher, seeing what others missed, gathering the information that would save lives. But at 1,130 hours, something unexpected happened that would change everything. A convoy of 3 vehicles arrived at the facility, and from the reaction of the guards and training cadre, Irene knew immediately that this was significant. She trained her optics on the vehicles as their occupants emerged, and her breath caught in her throat. The man stepping out of the lead vehicle was someone she recognized from intelligence briefings. Khalid Mansour, a high-value target who'd been responsible for coordinating attacks throughout the region. He was believed to operate from across the border, rarely venturing into areas where coalition forces could reach him. Yet, here he was, 200 yards from Irene's position. She immediately began recording, documenting Mansour's arrival and the individuals who greeted him. This was intelligence gold, confirmation of his involvement with this facility and evidence that could be used to authorize a targeted strike. But it also created a dilemma. If Mansour was here, there was an opportunity to eliminate him directly rather than waiting for a future operation. One shot, and one of the most dangerous insurgent leaders in the region would be neutralized. But taking that shot would compromise her position, likely result in her capture or death, and potentially waste the intelligence she'd gathered on the facility itself. Irene keyed her radio, speaking in barely a whisper. Main element, this is Overwatch. Critical intelligence update. High-value target Khalid Mansour just arrived at facility. Request guidance. The response took longer than usual, and Irene could imagine the intense discussion happening at Thompson's position. Finally, his voice came through. Overwatch. Confirm positive identification of HVT Mansour. Confirmed. Multiple visual angles. Positive ID. He's meeting with facility leadership now. Another pause. Overwatch. Continue observation and documentation. Do not engage without authorization. We're contacting higher command for guidance. Irene watched through her scope as Mansour conducted what appeared to be an inspection of the facility, accompanied by several senior cadre members. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed he was safe, untouchable in this remote location. 15 minutes later, Thompson's voice returned. Overwatch. Higher command is requesting live feed if possible. Can you establish data link? Negative. Data transmission would significantly increase my electronic signature and risk compromise. But I'm recording everything. Mansour is conducting a detailed facility inspection, suggesting this location is important to his network. As Irene continued her observation, Mansour moved to the training area where advanced tactics were being demonstrated. She documented the entire visit, noting the deference shown to him and the way he personally instructed some of the training activities. This wasn't just a courtesy visit. Mansour was directly involved in developing the fighters being trained here. At 1,430 hours, Mansour's convoy prepared to depart. Irene watched through her scope, knowing that this might be the only opportunity to eliminate him. Her finger rested lightly on her rifle's trigger guard, not yet on the trigger itself, but ready. Main element, HVT, preparing to depart. This may be our only opportunity for direct action. Thompson's response was firm. Overwatch, you are not authorized to engage. I repeat, do not engage. Higher command is coordinating a larger response. Your intelligence is too valuable to risk on a single shot. It went against every instinct Irene had. The target was there, vulnerable, and within her capability to engage. But Thompson was right. The intelligence she'd gathered could lead to shutting down the entire training network, not just eliminating one leader. Copy. Main element. Continuing observation only. She watched as Mansour's convoy departed, documenting their direction of travel and vehicle descriptions. As the dust settled behind them, Irene felt a mixture of frustration and professional satisfaction. She'd made the right tactical decision, even if it felt like a missed opportunity. The rest of the day passed in careful observation as she continued documenting the facility's operations. At 1,800 hours, as planned, she began preparing for extraction. She'd gathered extensive intelligence, confirmed the presence of a high-value target, and completed her mission without compromise. The extraction movement began at 2,100 hours, using the same Wadi system she'd approached through. Irene moved carefully, aware that the insurgents might have reinforced their security after Mansour's visit. The journey back to Thompson's position took 8 hours of cautious navigation through darkness. She reached the SEAL team's location at 0500 hours, exhausted but successful. Thompson met her personally at the perimeter, his expression showing both relief and professional respect. "Welcome back, Hill. Command is extremely interested in your intelligence. They've already authorized a strike on the facility based on your initial reports. The information about Mansour puts this in an entirely different category." Irene handed over her recording equipment and documentation. "Sir, that facility is training sophisticated fighters who'll be operating throughout the region. Shutting it down will have significant impact on their insurgent capabilities." "Thanks to you," Thompson replied. "Your infiltration provided the confirmation we needed to move forward with aggressive action. Higher Command is already planning a joint operation to interdict the facility and potentially target Mansour's network." As dawn broke over the desert, Irene allowed herself to feel the exhaustion she'd been suppressing for 48 hours. She completed one of the most dangerous missions of her career, gathering intelligence that would save countless lives. And she'd done it not despite the judgments others had made about her, but by proving that those judgments were meaningless in the face of skill, determination, and courage. Patterson approached with a canteen and a protein bar. "Ma'am, that was the gutsiest operation I've seen in 15 years of special operations. You're either incredibly brave or completely insane." Irene smiled tiredly. "Probably a bit of both, Senior Chief." The extraction from the northern sector took 3 days of careful movement through hostile territory. Thompson's team moved in stages, using darkness and terrain to avoid the increased insurgent patrols that had flooded the area following Mansour's visit. Irene rotated through the team's security positions, her skills now fully integrated into their operational rhythm. On the final night before reaching friendly lines, Thompson called a halt in a defensive position that offered good cover and observation. As the team established security, he gathered everyone for a brief meeting. "I want to say something before we get back to base," Thompson began, his voice carrying the weight of sincerity. "This operation succeeded because every member of this team performed at the highest level. But I especially want to acknowledge Specialist Hill." The SEAL operators turned their attention to Irene, who felt suddenly self-conscious. When Hill arrived at FOB Scorpion, she faced skepticism and dismissal because of her appearance. Thompson continued, "A tattoo on her neck became more important to people than her service record, her training, or her capabilities. That was wrong, and it was a failure of leadership and judgment throughout the base." He paused, making eye contact with each team member. But Hill didn't let that dismissal define her. She prepared, she trained, and when the opportunity came, she proved that excellence has nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with character, skill, and determination. Her actions on this operation saved lives, gathered critical intelligence, and demonstrated the kind of courage and professionalism that defines the best operators in our military. Patterson spoke up. "Sir, if I may, when we started this operation, I had doubts. Not about Hill's technical skills, but about whether someone who looked like her could handle the physical and mental demands of special operations. I was wrong, and I apologize for that judgment." Other team members nodded, adding their own acknowledgments of the assumptions they'd made and overcome during the operation. Irene felt emotion rising in her chest, not from the praise but from the genuine recognition of the journey she'd been on. "Thank you, sir. Thank you all," she said quietly. "But I want to say something too. The military taught me that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. Yes, I faced prejudice and dismissal. Yes, it was frustrating and unfair. But I also learned that proving yourself isn't about changing others' minds through arguments. It's about demonstrating through actions that their assumptions were wrong. She touched the tattoo on her neck, a gesture that had become unconscious over the years. This tattoo represents who I am, a watcher, a protector, someone who sees what others miss. People looked at it and saw unprofessionalism. I looked at it and saw my purpose. The difference between those perspectives is what this operation has been about. Thompson nodded. When we get back to base, Command is going to want detailed debriefs on the intelligence we gathered. But I'm also going to make sure they understand the larger lesson here about how we assess and utilize personnel. The military can't afford to waste talent because of superficial judgments. The team reached FOB Scorpion the following afternoon, emerging from the desert like ghosts materializing from heat shimmer. A crowd had gathered, word having spread about the successful intelligence operation and the upcoming strike on the training facility. But this time, when Irene stepped off the transport vehicle, the attention wasn't skeptical or judgmental. It was respectful. Commander Hayes was waiting, and with him was a colonel Irene didn't recognize, someone whose insignia suggested he'd come from higher command specifically for this debriefing. Hayes approached first, extending his hand. Specialist Hill, welcome back. Outstanding work out there. Thank you, sir. The colonel stepped forward. Specialist Hill, I'm Colonel Anderson from Joint Special Operations Command. I've been reviewing the intelligence you gathered, and I need you to understand something. The information you obtained about Mansour's involvement with that training facility has catalyzed a major operation. We're coordinating strikes not just on that one facility, but on the entire network it supports. I'm glad the intelligence was useful, sir, Irene replied. Useful doesn't begin to cover it, Anderson continued. Your infiltration provided confirmation that our intelligence community has been seeking for months. The operation launching tomorrow will degrade insurgent capabilities throughout this entire region. Lives will be saved because of what you did. He paused, then added, I've also been briefed on the circumstances surrounding your arrival at this base. The skepticism you faced, the dismissal based on your appearance, that's unacceptable, and it represents a systemic problem we need to address. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, but Anderson continued. Commander Hayes has already acknowledged the mistakes made here, and I believe those mistakes have led to important lessons. But the larger military needs to learn those lessons too. With your permission, I'd like to use your experience as a case study in our leadership training programs. Irene considered the request carefully. Making her story public would mean exposing the prejudice she'd faced, but it might also help others who didn't fit the conventional military mold. Yes, sir. If it helps prevent other capable soldiers from being sidelined because of superficial judgments, I'm willing to participate. Thank you, Specialist. Now, let's get you debriefed and rested. You've earned it. 3 months later, Irene stood in a briefing room at a major military training facility, facing an audience of officers from across multiple services. The tattoo on her neck was fully visible, but now it represented something different than it had at FOB Scorpion. It was a teaching tool, a reminder of the lessons this audience had gathered to learn. Colonel Anderson was concluding his presentation on personnel assessment and utilization. The case of Specialist Hill demonstrates what happens when we let superficial characteristics override objective evaluation of capabilities. An operator with proven skills and excellent service record was sidelined because of visible tattoos that violated no regulations but conflicted with conventional expectations of military appearance. On the screen behind him, images from the Northern Sector operation showed the intelligence Irene had gathered, the training facility that had since been destroyed, and the network disruption that had followed. The cost of that prejudice was nearly catastrophic. Anderson continued, We had a critical intelligence asset sitting unused for 3 weeks. When she was finally given an opportunity, Specialist Hill not only saved lives, but gathered intelligence that led to one of our most successful operations of the year. He turned to Irene, who stood at the side of the room. Specialist Hill, would you share your perspective with our audience? Irene stepped forward, aware of every eye in the room, focusing on her neck tattoo before rising to meet her gaze. She'd given variations of this presentation a dozen times over the past 3 months, but it never got easier. When I arrived at FOB Scorpion, I knew I'd face skepticism, she began. I'd faced it before in my career. The tattoo makes me visible in a way that invites judgment. But I also knew that I was a highly trained operator with valuable skills and experience. The disconnect between how I was perceived and what I could actually contribute created a situation where both I and the unit suffered. She clicked to the next slide, showing her service record and qualifications. This is what people should have seen when I arrived. Advanced marksmanship instructor, survival and evasion specialist, multiple deployments with commendations. But instead, they saw this. She touched her tattoo, and they made assumptions about my judgment, my professionalism, my capabilities. An officer in the front row raised his hand. Specialist, with respect, don't visible tattoos suggest poor decision-making? They're permanent modifications that can affect how others perceive you. Sir, I got this tattoo after my first deployment as a reminder of who I am and what I fight for, Irene replied. The Celtic knots represent my heritage. The raven feathers symbolize being a watcher and protector. To me, it represents commitment to purpose. To others, it represented unprofessionalism. The difference in those interpretations reveals more about the observer than about me. She advanced to the next slide, showing statistics on military personnel with visible tattoos and their performance records. Research shows no correlation between visible tattoos and performance metrics. Yet, personnel with visible tattoos consistently face barriers to advancement and opportunity. We're potentially sidelined capable soldiers because of appearance rather than ability. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, with Irene fielding questions and sharing insights from her experience. When she concluded, the audience's applause was genuine, and several officers approached afterward to discuss implementation of new assessment protocols at their commands. Commander Hayes was among them, having been invited to attend as part of the case study. He waited until others had finished speaking with Irene before approaching. Hill, I wanted you to know that I've implemented significant changes at FOB Scorpion. We've revised our personnel assessment protocols, conducted training on unconscious bias, and established reporting mechanisms for soldiers who feel they're being unfairly evaluated based on appearance. That's good to hear, sir, Irene replied. It's not enough to erase my mistakes with you, Hayes continued, but it might prevent the same mistakes from happening to others. Your courage in sharing this story is making a real difference. After the presentation concluded, Irene walked outside into bright sunshine. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lieutenant Commander Thompson. Heard your presentation went well. Still the best operator I've worked with. When are you joining our unit permanently? She smiled at the message. Thompson had been trying to recruit her to his SEAL support team for months. It was an opportunity that would have seemed impossible during those first weeks at FOB Scorpion when she was relegated to equipment maintenance. As she walked across the training facility grounds, Irene reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The prejudice she'd faced hadn't disappeared, but it had been confronted and challenged. The tattoo that had defined her in others' eyes had become a symbol of the larger lessons about judgment, capability, and the danger of letting appearance override performance. She thought about her grandmother, whose stories had inspired the tattoo in the first place. The old woman had always told her that true warriors weren't defined by how they looked, but by what they stood for and what they were willing to sacrifice for others. In facing dismissal and proving herself through action rather than argument, Irene had lived those principles. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from a junior soldier she'd been mentoring, a young woman with multiple ear piercings who'd been facing similar skepticism at her unit. They're finally giving me a chance at the position I'm qualified for. Your story helped me find the courage to keep pushing. Thank you, Irene replied with encouragement, then put her phone away and looked up at the sky. Somewhere out there, soldiers were making judgments about others based on appearance rather than capability. But because of what she'd endured and overcome, maybe fewer of those judgments would go unchallenged. Maybe more capable soldiers would get the opportunities they deserved. The tattoo on her neck caught the sunlight, the Celtic knots and raven feathers as permanent as the lessons she'd learned and the changes she'd helped create. She'd been judged, dismissed, and underestimated. But she'd also proven that excellence transcends appearance, that courage can't be measured by conventional standards, and that sometimes the people who don't fit the mold are exactly the ones who can break through barriers others can't even see. Irene Hill walked forward into whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that she'd already faced some of the hardest tests a soldier could endure and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to serve with distinction regardless of others' expectations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.